let me first of all start the recording. So today we will continue with Renaissance, and at exactly 9 o'clock in 30 minutes, you will receive a notification on your blackboard, from your blackboard. It will be a quiz of 12 minutes. You will have 3 questions and you will be able to answer them. You will have only one trial and it will begin just at 9 o'clock. And then after 12 minutes, you will come back and we will continue our course. Now let's begin with Renaissance for today. So, this is our 5th week together, and we talked about, the generally art and aesthetics. Then we talk about the prehistoric art and mythology and the monuments and different way of expressing in a way, the myths. And then we will now look at an important era in art history and also human history, actually, because it's the beginning of many cultural and social and even political different eras. So we have again, by the way, I have to repeat it every time, but I don't have to in real. Write your full name, your name and surname on your Zoom when you are linked to Zoom, or your student number. If you do not put any of them, you will not be counted as attended because we will not know who you are. Just a nickname or just being here is not enough. We have to see your full names or student numbers. And I gave my notification again. This is the 5th week and I still repeat the same thing. Now we have required readings from you, the same book that you will find in your library. It's Hugh Hanner and John Fleming's A World History of Art. And the chapter 10 will be about, as you see, Renaissance. And if you want to have further readings, you can read from Nilüfer Öndin, Rönesans Düşüncesi ve Resim Sanatı, or the English one, Renaissance Thought and the Art of Painting, or from Larry Shiner, The Invention of Art. We have also some recommended videos. These notes will be, as always, will be downloaded on your Blackboard. Now, Renaissance, let's start with it. Renaissance, and the meaning of the word is rebirth. It's not like other, it's rebirth. It's born again in a way. Renaissance is an art, science, and cultural movement in 14th century Italy that flourished throughout Europe until the 17th century. It's a pivotal period in human history stemming from a rebirth of interests in classical learning. These classical learning is generally Roman and Greek learnings, philosophy, art, and their classical rules. The Renaissance ushered in an era of enlightenment and innovation that challenged the medieval norms of thought and expression. Actually, Renaissance is the top of art, science, and technology that intertwined together. It's the ultimate, actually, mix of everything. So the Renaissance idea shows us that the artists, the artist, the concept of artist is now just the beginning, the seeds of the genius artist is now spreading is with little by little. This is the beginning of this concept, and also this is the top, and this is the ultimate moment of art, science, and technology all together. It was a time of creativity where artists, scholars, and thinkers sought to rediscover the wisdom of antiquity while pushing the boundaries of knowledge and artistic skill. So, the technology, the techniques are very important, but what inspired them is actually the wisdoms and the techniques and the art and philosophy of antiquity. It was not just a historical epoch, but a transformative movement that reshaped the trajectory of Western civilization, leaving an indelible mark on art, literature, philosophy, science, and politics for years to come. So, Renaissance is not just an art movement, but it is in a way, the core of the Western civilization. Renaissance era saw a great revival of interest in the classical learning and values of ancient Greece and Rome. Against a backdrop of political stability and growing prosperity, the development of new technologies, including the printing press, a new system of astronomy, and the discovery and exploration of new continents. So you see, this is actually a very rich era of discovery and invention. And it was accompanied by a flowering of philosophy, literature, and especially art for us. When we talked about political stability and increasing prosperity, we are talking about cities in Italy, of course. Especially, they become richer through trade and become centers of welfare. Though the Catholic Church remained a major patron of the arts during the Renaissance, from popes and other prelates to convents, monasteries, and other religious organizations, works of art were increasingly commissioned by civil government, courts, and wealthy individuals. So, especially in the Renaissance, we see the patronage. That means that artists and they have customers. So customers orders paintings, sculptures, and these paintings and sculptures are reshaped and created according to the orders, to the requirements of the clients, the Catholic Church or the wealthy people. Especially, we will see the important families like Medici and Sforza in Italy. Venice was also one of the most important centers of Renaissance. So, two cities of generally Italy, Florence and Venice, are actually the core of these art movement. The Renaissance marked a profound shift in European art, philosophy, science, and society. One of its central ideas was humanism, a philosophy that emphasized the value, potential, and achievements of human beings as opposed to the more religiously centered view of the medieval period. So, the seeds, the fire of enlightenment is now to begin. Humanism focused on the study of classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, leading to a renewed appreciation for ancient philosophy, literature, and art. It emphasized human dignity, individual expression, and a deep engagement with the natural world. In art, humanism manifests in a focus on realistic human forms, individualized expression, and an interest in the natural world. Renaissance artists, influenced by humanist ideals, studied human anatomy, portrayed human figures in motion, and aimed to represent the world in a more naturalistic way, breaking away from the stylized and symbolic representation of the medieval period. If you look at the medieval period paintings, if you Google them, for example, these are uh, really very distant from they seems like more caricaturized uh, depictions of humans and animals. Especially the animals are really looks like too much distant than the ideal or the real ones. So these are really weak depictions, actually. So now for the Renaissance, the humanist ideals are now important. They are influenced by them. So they studied human anatomy, animal anatomy also, and they portrayed human figures in motion, and they aim to represent the world in a more naturalistic way. They break away from the stylized, as I mentioned, symbolic, even comic, even ironic representations of medieval period. Now we see the ideal anatomy, the ideal ratios, the ideal human and all the natural bodies. So, in general, Renaissance art is the decorative, fine, and applied arts produced during the Renaissance, a time in European history. Yes, it's in European history, but it influenced all the world history, actually. The cornerstone of Renaissance art was the classical antiquity, considered to be most noble of all historical traditions. The Renaissance period began in Florence, Italy, approximately in the 14th century. So the Florence is the heart of this actually era, this movement. The collection of work known as Renaissance art, which includes painting, sculpture, architecture, music, and literature, it was predominantly created in Europe throughout the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries under the combined effects of a heightened awareness of nature, a resurgence of classical learning, and a more individualized vision of men, women, human women. So major artists that we can say, Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci, we call, as we know, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo di Ludovico Buonarroti Simoni, known as Michelangelo, and Donato di Niccolo di Betto Bardi, better known as Donatello, etc. So these are the better norms. And actually, these are the norms that we remember, what we remain and recall exactly when we are talking about art and high art, actually. So, Florence and the beginning of Renaissance, how it actually started. The general idea of the Renaissance movement. It began in Florence in the late 14th century, rooted in the city's prosperous economy and its interest in rediscovering the intellectual and artistic achievements of classical antiquity. You know, you need a prosperous, especially economically prosperous environment to be able to focus on more intellectual and artistics. So this period marked a shift away from the medieval worldview, as we mentioned before, centered on religion and the afterlife. Now they are more human-centered. The philosophy is more human-centered. And this values individual achievement, the beauty of the natural world, and the potential for human progress. So all these intertwine together, and this creates the movement, the idea, the core of Renaissance. Florence during the Renaissance was the epicenter of cultural, artistic, and intellectual revival that transformed Europe. between these centuries, and this was often called the cradle of the Renaissance. So Florence was a hub of innovation, patronage, and humanistic ideals, playing a key role in the development of Renaissance art, literature, science, and philosophy. Of course, we will more focus on art and science and technology, so we will mention the discoveries and inventions. So these wealth, political influence, and patronage networks fostered an environment where thinkers and artists like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Dante Alighieri, Botticelli, and Donatello could thrive. So wealth, political influence, and political power, and patronage networks. So the meaning of the abundance of the clients in a way that allowed artists to flourish in a way. In the period which is called early Renaissance, Florence was not a city in the unified country of Italy as it is now, of course. It's an like city-state. Instead, Italy was divided into many city-states, Florence, Milan, Venice, etc., each with their own government. So they were ruled by despots and other were republics. So just before the middle of the 14th century, Florence had become a metropolis of about 90,000 people, making it one of the greatest cities of Europe, alongside Paris, Venice, Milan, and Naples. However, in the summer of 1348, the Black Death struck, reducing the population by half. So this is the, Renaissance was late 14th century. So the economy of the city remained depressed, and the rivalry of adjoining polities, first Milan and then Naples, only intensified the threat to Florence's prosperity in the early 15th century. One of the few successes was the conquest of Pisa in 1406, making Florence a maritime power at last. So, partly in self-defense, Florence became a major territorial power alongside Venice, Milan, and Naples. So, this is the rise of Florence again. So during this period of adversity, the power of the guilds and their domination of the city were on the wane. As a result, successful merchants and bankers, chiefly Cosimo de' Medici and Giovanni Rucellai in the 15th century, were able to shape civic politics and culture through a system of oligarchy and patronage. So now these families reshape Florence, and this is the rise of Florence again. So they were a big city, city-state, but because of the Black Death and the rivalries, they were threatened. But with time, they regained their power. So these families underwrote the accomplishments that are now singled out with the term Renaissance. It's the rebirth of, because this is, as you see, the Florence reborn after these families and also the powers and the conquest of Pisa, for example. And their palaces came to dominate the city as fully as the church buildings in which they established their family chapels. So we see that church is still important, is still a very big power, but these families with money, these rich families become also undeniable power sources. So Cosimo de' Medici became the leading citizen in Florence after his return in 1434 from a year of exile. He achieved this position by virtue of his great wealth. He was very rich, the result of the largest banking network in Europe. He has his own banking and extensive network of patronage obligations. So while he never accepted public office, his faction dominated city. So Medici's dominate Florence, and they are an undeniable force with the church, actually. So, economic prosperity and the wool trade. As I mentioned before, you have to be economic prosperity of economics, especially that you can focus now on different entertainments or on different works like art and music, etc. So Florence economic boom began in the 12th century, but it continued in the 14th century, and it was driven by its dominant role in the wool trade. The city became a major banking and financial center with the families like Medici amassing wealth through their control in international banking networks. So this wealth allowed them to act as major patrons of the arts and intellectual endeavors. And also the wealth gave them a quite freedom when the church, in an era where the church is very powerful actually. So the florin, it was Florence gold coin, the became a dominant currency across Europe, further solidifying the city's economic influence. So when your money is important and dominant, so that means that you are the most important, one of the most important powers. So the Medici family, they are very important. I think that you can recall them because in many also movies and many series like in the visual arts also we hear the name Medici really often. It is a very powerful and wealthy family, and they're powerful because of their wealth, of course, and their networks. They played an integral role in the flourishing of the Renaissance. So they invested in art and intellectual endeavors also. So they protected and they also ordered sculptures, paintings from really now that we mention important names, important artists of their times. Actually, in a way, we can say that they created, with their protection and their help and all their these sorry, and with all their support actually they allowed these artists to become much more powerful, famous, and also to be able to create art much more freely than the others. So important names are Cosimo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. These are important names of the family. And humanism and rediscovery of classical antiquity is an important part of the Renaissance. So yes, we mentioned the Medici family, these families, but also humanism and rediscovery of classical antiquity. Humanism, the philosophical backbone of the Renaissance, began in Florence again. Humanism emphasized the study of classical texts, focusing on the works of ancient Greece and Rome. Humanists believed that these works contain valuable lessons for improving life and society. So they rejected the medieval focus on divine intervention in human affairs, instead emphasizing individualism, secularism, and human potential. When you are in a much more free and powerful and wealthy economy and also a state like Florence, now you can focus yourself on much more intellectually free and on art, actually. Petrarch is often considered the father of humanism, and he was a Florentine scholar who advocated for the study of ancient texts and emphasized the value of individual human experience. So his discovery of Cicero's letters helped spark a wider interest in classical philosophy and literature. Giovanni Boccaccio was another Florentine writer. He contributed to the humanist movement through his collection of tales, the Decameron, which depicted human nature in all its complexity, reflecting Renaissance ideals of secularism and realism. Now you see that you can see the process of all these evolution and revolution actually of Renaissance. So now before continuing with patronage, and I want to remember that you will in 4 minutes you will receive a notification. This will be your from Blackboard. There will be a quiz. You will have 12 minutes, 3 questions, and just 1 trial. So it will begin at 9 o'clock and it will end at 9:12. Exactly the time is it. So I think for 3 questions it will be more than enough, but the connection problems or you can have some issues with Blackboard. This is why I give you 12 minutes of timing. So please open your Blackboards and in 2 minutes you will be able to start the quiz.
Professor?
Yes, Anas.
Um, is the quiz not supposed to show in Blackboard yet?
It will be just at 9 o'clock. You will be able to open it. It's in Blackboard under the exams and quizzes part. It will be again, as I say, at just 9 o'clock, and you will have until 9:12.
Okay, fine.
Hujam, there are only 3 questions.
Yes, there are 3 questions. And please do not leave the course after the quiz because we will continue and I will look at the attendance after the end of the quiz. And again, please write here your full names. The PC is not enough. I'm repeating the same thing from the beginning. From 5 weeks, it's more than 1 month, and you still do not writing your names and your numbers. Now let's continue with Renaissance and patronage. So we mentioned patronage before for the wealthy families. The flourishing of Renaissance art was made possible by the patronage system, which played a central role in the shaping of Renaissance art. So wealthy families, religious institutions, and political figures funded artists, commissioning works that align with their values, power, and influence. So the works should be aligned, should be according to the aesthetics of these patrons, of course. Patronage not only provided financial support, but also influenced the content of the works created. Patrons often dictated the themes of the works they commissioned, although many artists, particularly as their reputation grew, had greater freedom to pursue their own artistic visions, but not fully freedom, of course. Patronage wasn't just about funding art, it was also a way for patrons to display power, influence, piety, and cultural sophistication. The Catholic Church, along with the powerful families like Medici and Sforza, played a pivotal role in shaping the artistic output of the period. Let's look at the Medici family. These are one of the most important patrons of the Renaissance. Also, this is a very important family in the European history. So they supported many artists. The most famous ones are generally Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Sandro Botticelli. So their patronage allowed these artists to experiment with new techniques and ideas, creating works that reflected both religious themes and the growing interest in humanism. The papacy was also the Catholic Church. Generally, especially during the reign of Pope Julius II, was another significant patron of Renaissance art. The Vatican commissioned works like Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel and Raphael's School of Athens. So these are really important works of art, masterpieces. These works not only celebrated religious themes, but also incorporated classical ideas and humanistic values of the time. We had also secular patronage. Besides the church, secular rulers such as dukes of Milan and Mantua and wealthy merchants also became patrons of art. So their support often focused on art that reflected their personal prestige, power, and intellect. Isabella d'Este, for instance, was a major patron who supported artists like Titian and Leonardo da Vinci, shaping the content of their works toward both humanist and personal themes. Let's have a look at the Catholic Church as a patron. It was one of the greatest, largest and most influential patrons of art during Renaissance was the Catholic Church. Popes, bishops, and other high-ranking officials commissioned grand works of art to decorate churches, cathedrals, and religious spaces. So the church used art as a tool of religious instruction, spiritual inspiration, and also as a display of power. Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel. So this is one of the most important, famous ones, also the masterpiece of Michelangelo. The frescoes on the ceiling of Sistine Chapel in Vatican are among the most famous artworks in history. Pope Julius II commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling in 1508. Despite being a renowned sculptor, Michelangelo reluctantly accepted the task, feeling more comfortable with sculpture than painting. He was more into sculpture than painting, but this is the patronage of the Catholic Church, and to have other orders he have to obey. And it was really against the character of Michelangelo, because they say that he was actually a very hard person to be to actually to communicate, to get along. And some theories that say that he was actually an autistic, and of course because of the neurodivergence was not a field that they know in these times. Even today, it's too new for us. It's a new subject in a way. So he was actually a special person. So he was treated actually like a very difficult one. But because of his genius and his great art, he was actually accepted and in a way tolerated even by the Pope. So we had also the Vatican St. Peter's Basilica and Raphael's works for Pope Leo X, for example. Let's look at the Medicis again, famous supporters of the movement. They governed Florence more than 60 years, starting with Cosimo de' Medici, and they were affluent Italian bankers who controlled Florence throughout the 1400s. Lorenzo Medici was the head of the renowned Florentine, and the Medici family gained enormous respect and importance in society thanks to Medici Bank. So the Medicis, Cosimo de' Medici, Lorenzo de' Medici, the Pazzi conspiracy, etc. So let's have a look at them also. So Cosimo de' Medici was known as the Cosimo the Elder. He was the patron and the great patron of arts, and also he was the head of the family. Then Lorenzo de' Medici, he was known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was can be considered as the greatest of the Medici patrons because he nurtured a generation of artists that includes Michelangelo, of course. He took into his household when the artist was still a young boy. So think about how actually they invested in the arts and in intellectual, actually in intellectual works of art. So this is a general view of the Medici family. We can have a look at this. Besides Medici's, there were other families like the Sforza family, which is very important because of Leonardo da Vinci. They were the main patron for Leonardo da Vinci. And also they had Duke Federico de Montefeltro, which are also leaders and patrons of Renaissance art. So let's now look at the characteristic of, in general, Renaissance art, also techniques. There are numerous key qualities that artists introduced to help us comprehend Renaissance paintings and other art forms like sculpture and architecture. All these factors influence the composition's aesthetics, the way that colors and light are used, and the accuracy of proportions shown. Among these characteristics are naturalism, contrapposto, chiaroscuro, and one-point perspective, also known as linear perspective. So these are the technical inventions also of the time. For, of course, their art pieces for paintings and sculptures. The Renaissance is most known as a period of unparalleled artistic innovation and technical advancement, revolutionizing the way art is created, perceived, and appreciated. So yes, this is a really unique era And this Renaissance is a very major revolutionary epoch for art and history of human. During this era, artists made strides to develop techniques that transformed visual arts. One of the most notable advancements was the mastery of linear perspective, allowing artists to create the illusion of depth and three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. So this is the beginning of the perspective. Perspective enabled artists to compose more realistic and immersive scenes. Through experimentation and collaboration, Renaissance artists pushed the boundaries of artistic expression, leaving behind a legacy of innovation that continues to be used, inspire, and captivate audiences for centuries. Now, even today, we always compare art pieces with Renaissance art. We see in general that what we recall in general is that the masterpieces of the Renaissance. This is like a future, like a point of reference for all kinds of arts, actually. What we are calling the new ways, what we want to mean as new ways of looking and interpreting. What does this mean for us? The Renaissance ushered in new methods for understanding and depicting the world. Now, artists began to view the world through the lens of observation and empirical study rather than through religious or symbolic interpretations alone. So now they observe and they try to be as realistic as possible. So they push the boundaries of the realism. This shift was heavily influenced by humanism and the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman thought. Artists studied nature, anatomy, and geometry to more accurately depict life. I mean, when they studied anatomy, just Leonardo da Vinci dissected more than 30 corpses, actually. So how they were focused and dedicated to study it. Observation. So Renaissance artists closely observed the world around them to better represent the human form, animals, landscapes, and architecture. This scientific and empirical approach to art resulted in more lifelike and detailed depictions, empathy, and emotion. In addition to physical realism, Renaissance artists introduced emotional depth in their work, seeking to capture not just how people looked, but how they felt. So the realism of physical realism and also emotional realism was the core of Renaissance art. So this focus on human experience was a direct outcome of humanism, of course. Sorry. Portrayal of human figures, changing notions of beauty and proportion. Renaissance artists revolutionized the depiction of the human figure, moving away from the flat, stylized figures of the Middle Ages and toward a more naturalistic and idealist representation. So I mentioned that the animals, the humans, seem so much like caricatures in medieval art. So let's see some examples of medieval art. Look at the depictions of humans, the depiction of the animals, the 3D, not the 3D, but 2Ds. No perspective, nothing. Here, the faces, They're all the same faces, not anything anatomical, anything realistic here. So, what they did, they study proportion and anatomy. Da Vinci, like Albert Dürer, meticulously studied anatomy using live models, cadavers, and ancient texts to understand the exact proportions of the human body. Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man is a prime example of this study, illustrating the ideal human proportions as defined by the Roman architect Vitruvius. So, as I mentioned before, Da Vinci dissected himself more than 30 bodies. They studied with cadavers. The beauty. The Renaissance brought about a new standard of beauty which often emphasized physical perfection, symmetry, and grace. Figures were portrayed with balanced, proportional bodies, reflecting an idealized version of humanity. However, this idealization was tempered by realism, as Renaissance artists also paid attention to individual characteristics such as wrinkles, expressions, and imperfections that made each figure unique. And here we see that we do not see that. And you look, they are playing chess, but there is no perspective on it. And they also used dynamic forms. Renaissance artists also began to depict the human body in motion. Figures were shown in a range of poses and actions, suggested fluid movement, and also the movement, the dynamic forms reflected better also the emotional depth. And we will see it in, for example, for Leonardo da Vinci. This dynamic portrayal was a significant departure from the rigid frontal figures of earlier periods. So this is exactly what they were escaped from. These were the medieval art examples. So the Renaissance artists were inspired by both the classical ideals of beauty and a new interest in observing the natural world. So there should be a balance between them. Artists like Da Vinci and Michelangelo blended the idealized forms of antiquity with a deep commitment to studying human anatomy, nature, and their surroundings. During the Renaissance, the study of human anatomy became more scientific, leading to more accurate and proportionate. Just a moment, please. Sorry. So artists like Donatello, Raphael, and Michelangelo, they depicted the human form with an emphasis on symmetry, balance, proportion, and drawing heavily from ancient Greek and Roman models. The idealized figure in Renaissance are often exemplified of controlled grace, physical perfection, and dynamic movement, reflecting the belief that human beings could be as beautiful and perfect as the divine. So at the same time, the realistic portrayal of the human figure, complete with individualized facial expressions and gestures, began to reflect an emerging belief in the importance of the individual. So this shift marked a change from the more symbolic and stylized figures of the Middle Ages. While they sought to portray perfect proportions and harmonious compositions, they also paid great attention to realism, portraying textures, lighting, and human emotions in intricate detail. So, for example, Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man combines the ideal mathematical proportions of the human body with a realistic study of human anatomy. So, in their sculptures and paintings, Renaissance artists aimed to capture both the physical perfection of the human form and the subtleties of human emotion on movement, bridging the gap between idealization and realism. So, balancing idealist beauty with realism. This is what we are talking about. Renaissance artists were deeply influenced by this classical idea of beauty, symmetry, proportion, and harmony, as we mentioned. But the realism was also important. So they tried to balance them, as we mentioned in the before. To balance this idealization, they studied, as we said before, and let's repeat, anatomy, proportion, and nature in every details. So they studied human anatomy and experimented with light and shadow. This is chiaroscuro that we mentioned. Using the light, the balance of light and shadow to create lifelike figures and scenes. So especially for example, if you remember from the first week, the master of chiaroscuro is Caravaggio, for example. So Da Vinci's sketches of human anatomy, for example, they show a deep understanding of how muscles, bones, and skin work together. And his portraits, such as the Last Supper and like Mona Lisa, they reflect a lifelike representation of human emotion and facial features. So you know the mysterious smile, the realistic smile. She's smiling or not smiling. There is very mysterious but lifelike uh, expression on Mona Lisa. This is coming from the method of sfumato. It's the technique of blending colors and tones without harsh lines, so the softer passages on it, so that she looks like smiling, but with a graceful and soft smile, a mysterious smile. So all these contributed to a more realistic depiction of figures. So they created these techniques and they use these techniques in different parts of their work to make this idealization, but balanced with realism. It's really technically impressive and emotionally resonant because they capture not just the physical, but also it's the interpretation of ideal for humans, forms, values, and also in the empathize. So let's look deeper with this depth, perspective, and visual illusion. So the main core, of course, of this is the visual illusions. One of the most revolutionary advancements in Renaissance art was the development of techniques to represent depth and perspective, more real life. So these innovations allowed artists to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat canvas, changing the way viewers interacted with paintings. Now, as you are now a part of the scene in the works. Renaissance artists were deeply concerned with accurately representing the physical world and human experience in their paintings. So the use of linear perspective, the foreshortening, this is distorting figures to give the impression of that depth. So as you see, when you are closer, for example, the figures shortens and they are bigger, and the ones for example at the phone more distant than you look smaller. So this is generally the use of linear perspective and foreshortening. And a careful attention to light and shadow, they allowed artists to give the impression of three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional canvas. For instance, in works like Masaccio's The Holy Trinity, the figures and architectural elements seem to exist in real space, extending back into canvas. Three-dimensionality versus two-dimensionality. So these techniques. Three-dimensionality, they use perspective, shading, foreshortening to suggest depth and volume in their paintings, so to create this illusion. They sought to create the illusion that figures, objects, and architecture existed in real space rather than being confined to the flat surface of canvas. But despite these innovations, there are still artists who used two-dimensionality for their work, and they also created this the the spirit of Renaissance with the two-dimensionality, and it shows their mastery actually. This is Sandro Botticelli, Primavera and the Birth of Venus. I think you should have heard of them. There is no perspective in these paintings, but they are still having the technical features and the mastery of Renaissance in their own selves. This is a conscious and personal choice of not using using dimensionality. Another visual illusion is chiaroscuro, a technique of it. Artists also experimented with these techniques, the use of light and shadow, to enhance the three-dimensionality of their subjects. And Leonardo's use of sfumato, the gradual blending of colors and tones, also contributed to the realistic depiction of depth and form. So we know that Da Vinci is the master of sfumato, and I mentioned Mona Lisa to you. Sfumato, again, is a technique for blending colors and tones so that transition between light and dark are soft and gradual, creating a hazy, smoky effect. So sfumato, or the subtle blending of colors to create soft transition and atmospheric effects, was perfected by him. So as you can see here, especially around her eyes, her smile, like there is a blending of color. There is a very soft, there are no sharp lines, sharp passages of colors, but the blending of the colors is so soft and the passages are so subtle and so graceful, so that they gives a real life depiction to the painting. So this makes so actually Leonardo da Vinci's sfumato so much better than the other ones. And this is the mastery of the technique. And of course, knowing these techniques is not enough. It's to know how to apply them is also a mastery. So applying them, for example, around the eyes, around the smile. So using this technique there shows us that another mastery of Da Vinci, because he knows where to apply the right technique actually to give the illusion, the emotional illusion that he wants to give us. Light and shadow, artists like Caravaggio used chiaroscuro, and we know that he is the master of light and shadow. Actually, Caravaggio is much like the end of Renaissance and the Baroque because of the heavy using of shadow, but he is also in Renaissance. And we know that, for example, the calling of Saint Matthew, this one, the light that is calling the saint to the God's light has chosen the man to become a God's man. So here he shows us how you can see it's like there is really light in here and they're in shadow. So this is an illusion of light and shadow, and this is called chiaroscuro. This is the technique of shortening, as it was used by Andrea Mantegna, Lamentation of Christ. As you see, the body looks shortened because as you are at the bottom of the feet and you are at the bottom of the bed, then from this position you see the bodies, the generally objects in general, shorter than they are. So this is a visual perception. So this is how they wanted to show it as realistic as possible with the shortening technique. We mentioned the anatomical studies, how they dissected actually the real bodies, cadavers, and also the golden ratio and proportions. So this is what we know. The golden ratio, the perfection, this perfection of symmetry. So many Renaissance artists, architects, and theorists like Leon Battista Alberti and Piero della Francesca incorporated the golden ratio and other mathematical principles into their work. So Vitruvian Man of Da Vinci is also one of the perfections of these ratios. Let's look at the linear perspective. This is much more actually like the most important techniques of the time, of the era. Linear perspective. The invention of linear perspective is attributed to Filippo Brunelleschi, and it was theorized by Leon Battista Alberti, and they changed fundamentally the conception of the perception of how space is depicted in art actually. This is a mathematical system that allows artists to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface. So it was formalized by Filippo Brunelleschi, but it was further developed and theorized by Leon Battista Alberti. And the first one to apply this technique is the artist Masaccio, and he applied it in the Holy Trinity. Sorry. Sorry again. So this is important. This can be a question for you in your midterm. So the one who formalized it was Filippo Brunelleschi. He was an architect and engineer from Florence again. And he was famous for designing the dome of Florence Cathedral, for example. This dome is also a piece of mastery of engineering and mathematics. So the design of it and the system, the foundation of it is architectural also, innovation. So these are about Filippo Brunelleschi. Please read them. I'm just not telling you every page again, as I mentioned. So Leon Battista Alberti, who theorized, who made this formula, this creation as an he codified the principles of what Brunelleschi actually discovered, who made it as a system of it. He theorized it. So he was an Italian humanist, architect, or an artist. So as you see, he is an artist, he's an architect, he's a humanist, so he's everything. Known for his contribution to the theory of art and architecture. So he is much more than a theoretician. And Masaccio, he was an artist, he was a painter, and he was famous because he was the first one who, this is the first application of perspective. This was the first application was made by Masaccio. Again, Brunelleschi invented it, Battista, he theorized it, and Masaccio applied it. aerial atmospheric perspective, in addition to linear perspective, Renaissance artists developed aerial or atmospheric perspective in which distant objects appear blurrier, paler, and less detailed. So what is closer, like in perspective, the three dimension, they are bigger, and what are in the font are like blurrier, like they're smaller, they're paler, less detailed. This is what our eyes actually see them. So you see that at the background of Mona Lisa also. Now, as we mentioned before, at the first week, actually, the concept of the artist as a genius, as a creative person, as the art that we are talking, the concept of art that we are talking today was, yes, the seeds were spread in Renaissance. So the craftsman, the passage from the craftsman to genius started, the birth of the artist started with Renaissance, but still there was no idea such as art for the sake of art, or the artist is a genius and creative person, different than just an who makes crafts, who creates orders, for example. So this began, but although this began in this era. So the Renaissance saw the artist, the birth of the artist, as an individual genius. So a significant shift from the medieval notion of the artist as a mere craftsman. Now there are no more just craftsmen. They are more than craftsmen, but still they are not 100% free and artists, accepted as artists. Like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, they were celebrated not only for their technical skills, but also for their creativity, intellect, and unique vision. So this is also thanks to the patronage, because they took these persons and they invested on them. So this change was partly due to the humanist belief in the power of individual achievement and expression. As artists began to be viewed as intellectuals and creators of profound cultural value, they gained more autonomy over their work. They gained more autonomy. The rise of art academies also formalized the training and status of artists, further elevating their social position. Artists were no longer seen as anonymous laborers, but as creative minds whose works could influence society, politics, and religion. The status of the artist grew to the point where individuals like Michelangelo could negotiate with patrons from a position of authority, rather than being seen merely as artisans fulfilling a commission. So some names has more liberty than the others. So do you remember, let's remember it, the perception of art in ancient Greece, and it was the similar approach existed in the Middle Ages. It was techne. The free arts, for example, included grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry. But the mechanical arts were lower than free arts, and they were like architecture, sculpture, and painting. So techne arts and craft arts, these, let's remember these classifications. So although some changes were made, the classification of arts as free and mechanical continued in Renaissance also. So we said it started, but it was not actually finalized. So even artists who are considered geniuses today, such as Da Vinci, Michelangelo, were treated as second-class artists next to free artists. Nevertheless, the Renaissance lit a fuse. Both the new class formation and the splendor and excitement created by the great masters of Renaissance encouraged Europeans that they were capable of competing with, if not surpassing, the ancient Greek and Roman masters. In addition, the decline in the prestige of religious institutions due to the Reformation movements paved the way for the newly emerging middle class and provided relief. So the self-confidence gained step by step between the 15th and 17th centuries, ignited on all kinds of transformation from science to technology and to art. This was still the classification of art in Renaissance. So just after the 17th century, in 18th century, we mentioned now the art for the art. Dear friends, let me mention it again. The quiz was between 9 and 9:12. So if you were not here during the quiz, you missed the quiz. I cannot repeat the quiz for you. It was open and it's closed. It's a technical blackboard thing. So you will have other teachers who will make quizzes, so you can, I think, have other quizzes with them. So this is closed for the time. So remember from the first week, Caravaggio's, this was what I meant. Yes, Caravaggio, he was the master of chiaroscuro, for example. He was one of the geniuses that today we call them geniuses, the masters of art. But in their time, they had to obey to the orders and to the aesthetics of the patrons. Remember the first week's discussion. In this era, we see the rise of the art academy also. The first art academies were founded in the Renaissance, such as the Accademia del Disegno in Florence in 1563. So these institutions provided structured training in techniques of drawing, painting, and sculpture, elevating art from a craft to a learned discipline. So the rise of the academies is also the fusing of this light. Let's look at some famous Renaissance artists and their famous works. Donatello, we mentioned before, he was one of the most influential and innovative sculptors of the Italian Renaissance, and he is widely considered one of the pioneers of Renaissance art, and his work in sculpture had a profound impact on the development of realistic human-centered forms that characterized the period. So his mastery of a wide range of materials like bronze, marble, and wood, and his ability to imbue sculptures with deep emotional expression and his revival of classical styles make him quintessential Renaissance man. So though he is less commonly identified with this term compared to figures like Da Vinci. His David was a very famous. So the sculpture of David is the story. It's a biblical story. It's a young man who defines the giant, the Goliath, the giant. He is just young and he is very courageous. So this is a biblical story. So this is also why it was depicted often by sculptors or painters. Michelangelo is one of the most important figures of the Italian Renaissance. He is an extraordinary master in sculpture, painting, architecture, and poetry, and he is widely regarded as one of the greatest artists all time. So when you recall an artist, it's very common for us to think about Da Vinci or Michelangelo. So he was, as I mentioned, had a complex and often difficult personality. He was known for being intense, melancholic, and reclusive. And as I mentioned, from today's proofs and studies and the theories, they say that he is actually an autistic person, probably. But unfortunately, they weren't, even today, we are not very familiar with the neurodivergencies, so that he was thought like a difficult and problematic person. But even with all these features that he has, he was really tolerated and accepted, and also he was valued by these patrons, even the church, actually, even Pope Julius II, the Medici families, Pope Paul III, they were accepting his genius, actually, in a way. So his most important works are David, again, the same subject, the same topic. Pieta, it's an early masterpiece of him, and Moses, the part of Tom for Pope Julius II. These are his most important works, actually, that we can recall at the first. So this is Pieta. This is the mourning of Mother Mary regarding the loss of his son, Jesus. And you can see the mastery of the emotions. She is a mother, not a religious figure here. So this is the grief of a real mother's grief, and you can see the mastery, the use of the technique, the use of the wrinkles, the shadows, you can get the softness of the material that used. This is marble, just. This is Moses, the depiction of Moses. You may see the idealistic, also realistic proportions of human body, the muscles. Look at every muscle that is now constructed by his mastery, by his techniques. Michelangelo's David is a very famous sculpture. Yes, it's a biblical hero. It's a repeating subject, but Michelangelo's interpretation to the work is much more different than the others. So when you look at the others, actually the depictions of David with others, sculptors or other artists, so they generally use Goliath as well. So in here, Michelangelo has just focused on David, the young warrior, actually. As you remember, last week I mentioned the monumentality of the work of him. It was monumental because it's in size and it's a masterful representation of the human form. That's why this is an important work, and this is one of the most famous Davids of the whole art and human history, actually. Although Michelangelo was a sculptor, he liked the sculpture much more than painting, but he was also a master in painting. And we see that in Sistine Chapel ceiling, the mastery of the use. And this is also a monumental work, The Last Judgment. And it was a huge ceiling also. And look at the whole story, the depth, and also the symbolism, the hidden symbolisms in the painting. He was also focused on architecture, like St. Peter's Basilica, the Laurentian Library. But what we know about him is actually the most important are the sculptures and the Sistine Chapel's paint ceiling, actually. So this is a general look at the other, actually, Davids, just for you to show the difference of him. Now let's look at Da Vinci. To Da Vinci also, he is the most famous known of all time, actually. He is what Renaissance man is. He is the ultimate depiction of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and art together, actually. He is the whole package in a way. He has an insatiable curiosity. He was an inventive genius. His artistic talent and all that made him the most versatile and influential figures of Renaissance. He had an insatiable and insatisfiable curiosity. He was so curious, so wanted to make so much things that his works, many of his works are halfly done, actually. He was just starting one work and then he was bored and he was passing to another because he finished everything in his mind and he wanted to focus on other ideas. So this was a challenge for the patrons because they were commissioning him, they were ordering a painting from him, but it wasn't finished. We will see that, for example, here, Adoration of the Magi. So this is not a finished work, but you may see the mastery and also the techniques that is still used by him. Of course, the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper are the most famous ones. Da Vinci's Last Supper is a fresco. It's on the wall of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. And beyond its physical size, it is the mastery of all the techniques that you are able to know on Renaissance. The mastery of the perspective. You see like how the room is focused on the head of Jesus. So this is just the moment where he announces the traitor. So all the bodies are aligned, all his allies here, and the traitor is just the one who is inclined, the dynamic of the motion, if you can see, the dynamics, the motion. So he is in a different direction of all his actually allies. This is the traitor. His face, his looking, his emotional reactions are different than the other ones. His positioning is different. His movement, his body movement includes is different. So all these techniques and these emotional depth is used as the mastery of the ultimate mastery of him. He was a master of art, of course, but at the fond of it, he has this curiosity for science and innovation and inventions. And mostly he was, in a way, a researcher. So his Vitruvian Man, his anatomical sketches, his drawings of the human heart, embryos, the musculature, like the Vitruvian Man, like the muscles, how they were depicted so realistically. And he studied pages and hundreds of pages of drawings he has. He was an engineer and inventor. He were focused and he was obsessed with flying machines. He was obsessed with birds, for example, how these birds can fly, how every different species of bird can move their wings. He was obsessed with these observations. So the flying machines, the military inventions also. Many of these drawings can now be realized with the technologies of contemporary technologies, but in his time, he was also very obsessed with it. So his notebooks are, as we mentioned again, very famous, are full of drawings like here. These are just examples that we can, just a few of we found. And also we say that he was, when I mentioned automatons, for example, he was also inspired by Al Jazari, like the others, the old texts from not just Roman or Greek, but he was also with the other ones. So he was protected and he was patroned by Medici's and specialist forces. And he had also good relations with the church because he was also the Last Supper, for example, is one of the most important and most valued paintings for these Catholic depictions. Da Vinci, like many artists of his time, rarely signed his works, and there are no confirmed examples of his signature on his painting. So this was a common for Renaissance artists. If you look at the works of Michelangelo, there is just one signature of him that he was actually very remorseful after that. He didn't like how the signature is depicted. So these artists were not often using signature. The concept of signature was often lacked in them because their work weren't their work in a way. This was works that under the patronage system, their reputation and body of work were more important than the individual authorship. I will mention also Paolo Uccello. The Battle of San Romano is a very important painting of him. It's a three pieces painting, and all the three pieces are in different actually museums. Why it's important? Because he was obsessed with linear perspective. He was just look, this is like a blueprint of in architectural design. So this is a work of mathematics, not more than the painting or the artistry. The perspective is what makes Uccello's perfection. Actually, he perfected the science of perspective in a way. Let's mention another name, Dürer. He was a painter, printmaker, and theorist. We mentioned the, the printmaking also. He was one of the important names in it. He encompassed painting, woodcuts, engraving, and theoretical writings. These artistic innovations of him are also makes him one of the important names of their time. He is a bridge that we can call between Northern and Italian Renaissance art. And what makes him also different in another way is that he was the one who signs his works. Look, this is a self-portrait of him, and this is, as you may see here, his signature designed specially by him. So we can say that he is actually the first who uses signature on his works. Now he owns his work. He started to, with him, the artist owning his own work, being the master of his own work starts. So this is why he is also an important name. He has also good relationships with patronage and church. He was not just also a master of artistic technique, but he was also a visionary. He emerged intellectual currents of Italian and Northern Renaissance. Another important name is John Y. Eyck. He is a Flemish painter. Now we are going to more Western. We are going out of Italy. his oil painting, the mastery of oil painting is important for him. In some sources, you may see that he invented oil painting, but the oil painting was invented in the 18th century in Afghanistan. Sorry, 19 in Afghanistan. I mentioned here, but I don't remember. Sorry, but it was an invention of 18th century, but he mastered the use of oil painting. So what makes him different is the perfectionist, is the technique of it. So layering and glazing, the technique where thin translucent layer of oil paint are applied one over the other. So he uses this method. He mastered this method. He mastered the use of oil painting on detail and precision. So this was made him most important. And also his Arnolfini portrait. This is one of the most mysterious and interesting paintings of the art history, actually. You can still find new depictions and new interpretations of it. And also, it was signed. And here you can see a mirror, that in this mirror, you can see the positioning, the existing, it's a now new realism in a way, the ones who were looking at this couple. So these were, maybe one of them was the painter or that, but here you see that Arnolfini signed his, Jan Y. Eyck signed his work, and he said here in this Latin phrase, he says that he was here. So now the artist put himself in the painting. He owns, he claims his work in a way. So this is how the process goes now, the signing and then the presence of the artist. So now the artist claims himself, the artist starts to noticing that he was here. There is a concept of Renaissance man, as we mentioned before. The most influential name for it is Da Vinci. What are the key traits of a Renaissance man? What this refers? It's a person who is well-rounded, excelling in a wide range of fields, and embodying the ideals of Renaissance period, which emphasize the value of education, knowledge, and human potential. So if you want to be defined as a Renaissance man, just curiosity is not enough. You have to have curiosity, but a deep desire to learn and understand different fields of knowledge. You have to be creative, the ability to apply knowledge from one domain to another creatively. You have to be versatile. You have to have skills and expertise across multiple areas such as science, art, literature, and philosophy. So not just curiosity is enough. You have to have expertise and you have to have mastered this. You have to be excelling in a variety of pursuits, not just dabbling in them. So just being interested or curious is not enough. You have to be expert and master of all. So this was a very difficult, actually, depiction of it. So in this era, we see other names, other inventions and discoveries, like from Galileo, Nicholas Copernicus, the astronomy, mathematics, physics, all these, the now science, like the art, the knowledge of art, the academies start, the science also starts in this. This is the beginning of the Enlightenment. Astronomy, physics, mathematics, all these scientific fields now starts to develop. This is a time of development of new materials and techniques. For example, the use of canvas. Before that, Artists haven't just were painting on wooden panels. Now they are using canvases. Now they can make as large or as big as they want, or with any shapes of any dimensions. The engraving and printmaking starts because the printing press now is a discovery. Now a new technique in art also starts, like Albert Dürer's Melancholia. This is in engraving, this is in printing. This is now a new technique of art. Oil painting is now mastered, as we mentioned, the printing press. Now with the printing press, it has an impact on learning now that the texts and the art pieces can be spread more widen, and now people can reach books and art pieces much more easily. They can see now examples of it. So this is also make people to read more now. Astronomy and anatomy and medicine, the engineering and mechanics. So please read, just we don't have time. This is why I'm passing them. The hydraulics and water engineering, the paintings of the drawings of Da Vinci, for example. Cartography and navigation, they started now, the discoveries, the continents are discovered. And also colonization starts with time. Optics and lenses, hydraulics and water management. It is an era of new ideas in humanism. All these inventions, all the focus on human, the realism, the individual, they are now bringing us new ideas like humanism and reform and secularism and individualism. So another important place, as I mentioned, was Venice for the Renaissance art. It was another major city. It was another. He was called Serenissima. It was meaning of most serene, peaceful, calm. And I mentioned as before, if you are prosper, then you can focus on art and intellectual design. So that the now Renaissance spread much more in the time. So Renaissance was a period of incredible innovation in both techniques and tools of art. It was the introduction of perspective, new painting methods, and scientific study of nature and anatomy allowed artists to create works that were more lifelike, expressive, and technically advanced than ever before. So these innovations laid the foundation for the development of Western art in the centuries that followed, but also the Western culture and history, and also their whole political and social influence on the world. And these era also influenced movements like Baroque, Neoclassicism, and beyond. So this is it for today. I will upload again, as I mentioned, these notes, this presentation, and again, your video will be uploaded to Blackboard. So this is it for today. Have a good weekend, and now you can leave the classroom.